So, today I begin my 14th year as your pastor. And no. It's just an anniversary. And it's also the day 1 year ago that Jean was deported. And we have the bitter and the sweet together, don't we? And anniversaries ask you to ask interesting questions like, what if that didn't happen? You know? What if I hadn't come here? I'll tell you what I was about to do when Holly called. In the fall of 2004, I was the pastor of a very small church in North Hadley, Massachusetts. I had left Coral Gables, which was an exciting and big church, because Warren couldn't get a job there. We stuck it out for 5 years, 5 wonderful years, and said enough of commuting back and forth between Hartford and Miami. Uh-oh, you can't? I'm sorry. I think if I come back more. Okay, all right, use the mic. Anyway, I had been working with a vocational coach because I really had to stay out of trouble in North Hadley. A very purple congregation, farmers. They grew Brussels sprouts, and they did not think that the asparagus at the chicken suppers should be broiled. And we got one new member in the time that I was there, for about a year, and she was really interesting, and she snuck out for the chicken supper one night and broiled the asparagus instead of boiling it. And when they came and saw what that Susie Wood had done to the chicken supper, it was bad, very bad. And it was understood to be my fault, and I really didn't know anything about it. Anyway, I was working with a vocational coach. We'd moved back to Tamers, Massachusetts, where we have a big farm and really gorgeous gardens. An expert had put those gardens in, and I was trying to ruin them, but I was not completely succeeding. And the coach said, "Why don't you write more gardening books?" And I said, wow, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a pastor. It was a part-time job, and I'm going to write gardening books. I'd already written several, one called Teaching My Daughter to Mulch, which Pico Ayer has stolen the title of in his new book, The Urgency of Slowing Down. And this was about the difference between mulching hard and, really overworking yourself in the garden, and mulching the way my daughter, who was 6 then, was mulching, which was to take one leaf at a time and trot over and put it in there. And I was really getting mad at her because she was stronger than that, and I was carrying all this load, and she was being a little princess. The urgency of slowing down. Yoke easy, burden light. The other book was The Art of Spiritual Rock Gardening, which was a fun one. And the other one was Grassroots Gardening, Rituals to Sustain Activists. And one day, while I was here in the first year, Ralph Nader called me up, and he said, "I want to order 250 copies of that book. Can you give me a discount?" And I said, sure. And but then I said, "But Mr. Nader, I don't know you, and I'm pleased you like the book, but remember what happened in Florida in 2000? And he said, yeah. And I said, that was a bad move. Bad move. 70,000 votes, and we lost by 600. The reason all this stuff is happening is not Ralph Nader, but it is purity politics. And we're going to get to that in a minute around the Elizabeth Street Garden. But for now, let me tell you some of the biggest things that have changed in these 13 years. On East 18th Street, where Laurie used to garden, and where her sign is still hanging in the backyard, which says there's nothing like a garden. You're never closer to God than there. Sign is still there, but the light's gone, Laurie. The Cabrini Hospital is now a high-rise that knocked out 80% of the light we used to have, which was only an hour a day. So you can't grow things without light. You just can't. So we've turned the backyard at Grace House into a dog run, which is just fine. But gardening is something that happens for those of us who love it as a sacred thing. We garden in our sacred places. We take off our shoes in a certain way. We do what Joshua suggested that we should do when we need to stop running and start stopping, when we urgently need to slow down, when we need to do something that fights the distractions. The American Psychiatric Association is not the only one who gets it. Now, maybe gardening's not for you, but something's got to be true for you that stops you from being distracted. Do you ever wonder why lion tamers hold up a chair? It's really an interesting thing. They hold up the chair to distract the lion, so the lion sees the legs and doesn't get to the lion tamer. That's what happens, of course, to us, is that most of our days look like there's somebody dangling a chair in front of us, and you don't really know what you're supposed to do next. Gardening or any refreshment in a sacred site is a way to relax and not be distracted. And if cities knock out much more of the sun or the air, it will be even harder than it is not to be distracted. A friend of mine says that he only wants to have two-hand experiences. And I said, what does that mean, two-handed experiences? He said, holy experiences, sacred experiences. Because he said, I am always multitasking. I'm always doing one thing with this hand and something else with that hand. And it's driving me crazy. And so I said, well, what's a two-handed experience? He said, well, my friend had an infant, and the child was a month old, and he said I could hold her. You think I was going to hold that baby with one hand? No, I was going to hold that baby with two hands. Of course, you think of prayer. The motion of prayer is something when you put your hands together. Or you think of when we ordain someone, right? We lay both hands on them. We get up close and lay both hands on them. When we embrace a friend we haven't seen for a long time, you don't just go, hi. You go, hi, and you embrace doubly. In the garden, maybe you're only using one hand, but you're having a two-handed experience. You're understanding something that is sacred. So in the little passage from Joshua that we just read, there is the claim that somebody is telling Joshua to stop here. Joshua, for the first 5 chapters in the book, has been wandering, and he's been killing. He's been taking over territory. He did the Philistines, and then he did this one and that one, and he's going and going and going, and all of a sudden, this angel comes up to him and says, well, why don't you just stop here? Joshua, take your shoes off. The place on which you are standing now is holy ground. It's where you're supposed to be. And sure enough, Joshua does that. He just stops there and says, this is my place. So what is going to happen in District 1, Councilwoman Margaret Chin's district, at the Elizabeth Street Garden? What's going to happen is that something very important that we also need, which is affordable housing, is going to go up and take away most of that garden. That's what's going to happen. And that means that when Lee wants to go outside, or Kari wants to go outside, or Donna wants to go outside, or Micah wants to go outside, there are going to be fewer places for us to go. This is bad for children. It's bad for older people. It's bad for me. And it's bad for you. So back to purity politics. We need to get better at politics. We need to get good at politics. We need to be effective at politics, like Doris Diether was. Any of you who were at that party the other night, it was so beautiful. And all the Pauls showed up and said, Mrs. Diether, you were good at what you did. Now, we did elect, many of us, not all of us, of course, our councilwoman in District 1, Margaret Chin. She is there to do what we need her to do. And we've got to figure out how she and other politicians can have imagination and can be strong enough to deal with the obvious conflict. It is a conflict between affordable housing and green, right? It's not a simple answer. But when you're good at politics, you work with people to make those kinds of hard decisions. Do you remember the 14% footprint of NYU a few years back they were planning on doing? We fought that in many, many different ways. And one of our slogans was NYU is just going to be so big that it will no longer be good. It's the bigness that makes us fail. So what happens in a city like New York, which increases population, right, and has opposing values of green and livability, affordability? How do we negotiate those things? I think we do it face-to-face with our city council people and offer to support them in making those hard decisions. And we do it with great respect for what they're facing. You see, NYU was on its route to being too big not to fail. The city itself may be on the route of too big not to fail. And that isn't Councilwoman Chin's problem. That is a matter of self-governance, of thinking, and knowing when to stop. And how do you stop? Population is always an issue fraught with racist ideas, fraught with classist ideas. Population is fraught. But at a certain point, if our village can't have a garden and affordable housing, can't figure out how to have a garden and affordable housing, don't we need to look further to find sacred ground? And the way to do that is necessarily through politics, rough and tumble, and non-purity. So thank you, Joshua, for stopping where you did, taking off your shoes and saying, this place is sacred ground. Amen.